When Sandra Bullock walks onto the stage of Uncensored with Marcus Reed, the audience erupts into enthusiastic applause. They've come to see America's sweetheart, the woman whose infectious laugh and down-to-earth charm have captivated viewers for decades. But tonight, something feels different. The usual warmth of a celebrity talk show is replaced by an undercurrent of tension that even the most casual observer can sense. Marcus Reed sits behind his imposing glass desk, his posture rigid and calculating. Known for his merciless interviewing style, Marcus has built his career on breaking celebrities down, on finding the cracks in their carefully constructed public personas and prying them open for the world to see. Tonight, Sandra Bullock is his target, and the glint in his eyes suggests he's been preparing for this moment for a long time. The studio lights seem harsher than usual, casting sharp shadows across the set. Sandra takes her seat gracefully, her smile genuine but guarded. She smooths her simple black dress, a stark contrast to the flashiness of the set around her. For a moment their eyes meet, and something unspoken passes between them. A recognition, perhaps, that this won't be the light-hearted conversation the audience might expect. Marcus adjusts his tie, a small, practiced movement that those who watch his show recognize as a prelude to his first strike. His producer, standing just off camera, gives a subtle nod. The red light on the main camera blinks steadily. The trap is set. "Sandra," Marcus begins, his voice deceptively casual, "you've been in the industry for what, 30 years now? That's a long time to stay relevant in Hollywood, especially for a woman." The emphasis on the last word hangs in the air. A few uncomfortable murmurs ripple through the audience. This is how it always begins on Marcus Reed's show, a seemingly innocent observation with a barb hidden just beneath the surface. Sandra's smile doesn't waver, but something shifts in her eyes. Those who know her well might recognize it, not as discomfort or offense, but as recognition. She's been here before, faced these kinds of thinly veiled provocations throughout her career. But what no one in the studio realizes yet is that Sandra hasn't come unprepared. As Marcus flips through his note cards, arranging his next series of increasingly personal questions, he doesn't notice the subtle change in Sandra's demeanor. He doesn't see her straighten her shoulders ever so slightly, or the way her hands, once nervously adjusting her bracelet, now rest calmly in her lap. What should have been a routine ambush interview? Another celebrity flustered and defensive, under Marcus Reed's notorious questioning, is about to take an unexpected turn, because while Marcus has spent weeks researching Sandra's vulnerabilities, preparing ways to expose her insecurities about aging in Hollywood, her failed marriage, her choice to adopt children, he's overlooked something fundamental about the woman sitting across from him. Behind the camera, the show's director senses something shifting. She's worked with Marcus for years, seen countless celebrities crumble under his calculated cruelty. But something about Sandra's calm presence makes her reach for her headset, alerting the camera operators to stay vigilant. This might not go according to plan. Marcus leans forward, his next question poised like a weapon. It's about Sandra's ex-husband, a topic she's famously avoided discussing in public. The audience collectively holds its breath, anticipating the awkward pause, the forced smile, the diplomatic non-answer that celebrities typically offer when cornered. But what happens next will change everything. The words Sandra speaks in response to Marcus's increasingly hostile questions won't just defend her dignity. They will reach beyond the studio, beyond the millions watching at home, touching something universal about human resilience, grace, under pressure, and the quiet power of authentic compassion. In just a few minutes, Marcus Reed, the man who has made a career out of leaving celebrities speechless, will find himself at a loss for words. The hunter will become the hunted, the interrogator the one being gently but firmly called to account, and not through anger, not through defensiveness, but through something far more powerful that no one, least of all Marcus, sees coming. By the end of this interview, the studio audience won't be thinking about celebrity gossip or Hollywood drama. They'll be reflecting on their own lives, their own choices, their own capacity for growth and forgiveness. And Marcus Reed himself will be forced to confront something he spent his entire career avoiding, his own humanity. Before we continue with this extraordinary encounter between Sandra Bullock and Marcus Reed, We want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Have you ever witnessed someone responding to hostility with unexpected grace? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories that reveal the deeper side of celebrity experiences, moments that go beyond the glossy magazine covers and rehearsed interviews, be sure to subscribe to our channel. Tomorrow, we'll be sharing another remarkable story about a beloved actor whose quiet act of kindness transformed a fan's life in ways no one could have predicted. Now, let's return to that tense studio where Sandra Bullock is about to teach Marcus Reed and all of us an unforgettable lesson about the power of responding to cruelty with wisdom and judgment with genuine understanding. The Paramount Studios lot buzzes with unusual energy tonight. Outside Studio 7, where Uncensored with Marcus Reed films, a line of excited ticket holders stretches around the building. Security guards with earpieces scan the crowd, their expressions professional but alert. This isn't just any taping. Sandra Bullock's appearance has drawn double the normal audience request. Inside the studio is a hive of coordinated chaos. Production assistants dart between equipment, clipboards clutch to their chests. Lighting technicians make final adjustments to the harsh spotlights that will illuminate every micro-expression, every potential moment of discomfort. The show's producer, Diane Matthews, stands at the edge of the set, her hawk-like gaze missing nothing as she speaks rapidly into her headset. Camera 3. I want you tight on Sandra when Marcus brings up the divorce. Camera 2. Stay on Marcus for reactions. This could be our highest-rated episode this season. The audience files in, guided to their seats by staff wearing black T-shirts, emblazoned with the show's confrontational slogan, "No filter, no mercy, no escape." Among them, diverse faces share a common anticipation, the electric thrill of potential controversy. Some hold small signs with Sandra's name or quotes from her films. A group of women in the third row wear T-shirts featuring Sandra's face, loyal fans who've followed her career for decades. The set itself is designed to create subtle discomfort for guests. The infamous interview chair sits slightly lower than Marcus's, forcing guests to look up at him. The backdrop features jagged, angular designs in cool blues and grays, psychologically proven colors and shapes that create unease. Nothing is accidental in this arena constructed for emotional ambush. In the green room, Sandra Bullock stands by the window, gazing at the framed photographs of previous guests on Marcus's wall. Many of these celebrities left the studio flustered, some in tears, a few vowing never to return. His reputation for breaking even the most media-trained personalities is precisely why many publicists steer their clients away from Uncensored. Sandra's publicist, Rachel, hovers nearby, her concern evident. "We can still cancel," she says, "not for the first time today. The contract penalty isn't worth what he might—" "It's fine, Rachel," Sandra interrupts gently. She turns from the wall, her expression serene. At 57, Sandra carries herself with the confident ease of someone who has weathered both adoration and criticism. Her simple black dress is elegant without being showy, her makeup minimal, her dark hair falling in soft waves around her shoulders. "I know exactly who Marcus Reed is," Rachel frowns, unconvinced. "He's been researching you for weeks. My contact in production says he's planning to ambush you about the adoption, the divorce, even those tabloid rumors from last year." A soft knock interrupts them. A young production assistant with nervous eyes appears at the door. "5 minutes, Ms. Bullock." Sandra nods, then turns to Rachel with a reassuring smile. Some battles aren't about winning, they're about changing the conversation entirely. Meanwhile, in his private dressing room, Marcus Reed adjusts his signature crimson tie. At 48, his carefully maintained physique and precisely styled, silver-streaked hair project the image he's cultivated. Ruthless, untouchable, feared. 3 Emmy Awards sit prominently displayed behind him, trophies earned through years of reducing celebrities to their most vulnerable selves. His executive producer, James, reviews note cards with him. We start with career questions. The recent box office disappointments, then transition to ageism in Hollywood. That should soften her up before we hit the personal stuff. Marcus nods, his expression calculating. The research team found interesting patterns in her charity work, always after negative press. Let's explore if philanthropy is just damage control for her. James smiles thinly. And of course, the adoption angle. Our demographics love when you question celebrity adoptions. Perfect. Marcus straightens, checking his reflection one final time. Time to give the audience what they came for. The stage manager's voice comes through the studio speakers. Live in 2 minutes. The audience settles, the excited murmurs diminishing as the lights dim slightly. The show's opening music, aggressive, pulsing beats, fills the studio as monitors display the uncensored logo, a microphone wrapped in barbed wire. Marcus strides onto the stage, confidence in every step. The audience erupts in applause, not the warm welcome of admiration, but the anticipatory cheer of spectators at a gladiatorial match. He raises his hands, accepting their energy, feeding on it. Welcome to Uncensored, he begins, his voice, carrying the practiced charm that masks the calculated cruelty to come. Tonight we have an actress who's been in the public eye for decades, through career highs, public heartbreaks, and controversial personal choices. Please welcome Sandra Bullock. The side door opens, and Sandra enters. The difference between her entrance and Marcus's is immediately apparent. Where he commanded, she connects. Her eyes meet audience members as she walks, her smile genuine. She waves to the group wearing her t-shirts, who cheer loudly in response. When she reaches Marcus, she extends her hand. The handshake seems friendly on the surface, but those watching closely might notice how Marcus holds her hand a beat too long, a subtle power play. The cameras capture this moment from multiple angles, the seasoned hunter sizing up his prey. They take their seats, Marcus behind his imposing desk, Sandra in the slightly lower guest chair. The studio lights seem to intensify, highlighting every detail of her face. Sandra, Marcus begins, leaning forward slightly. It's been a fascinating journey watching your career evolve, or should I say struggle to evolve in recent years. The first card is played. The audience shifts, some uncomfortable with the immediate aggression, others leaning forward in anticipation. The trap is set, the cameras poised to capture her reaction. But Sandra doesn't flinch. Instead, something unexpected happens in her eyes. A quiet recognition, not of Marcus's tactics, but of something deeper, something about the man himself that perhaps even he isn't aware of. The battle has begun, but not the one Marcus Reed had prepared for. The question hangs in the air like a suspended blade. Marcus Reed's opening gambit, disguised as observation, but designed as attack, has silenced the studio. Camera operators zoom in on Sandra's face, hunting for the first sign of discomfort. The director in the control room switches rapidly between angles, not wanting to miss a millisecond of reaction. Sandra takes a measured breath. Her smile remains, but it transforms subtly from polite to thoughtful. The audience, expecting defensiveness, or perhaps rehearsed deflection, leans forward collectively. Evolve is exactly the right word, Marcus, she says, her voice warm but unwavering. Evolution isn't always about climbing upward. Sometimes it's about growing deeper. Marcus's expression flickers momentarily. Surprise quickly masked by practiced neutrality. This wasn't the flustered response he anticipated. He glances down at his notes, regrouping. Deeper is certainly one way to describe it, he counters, his tone sharpening. Your last 3 films grossed less than half of your earlier work. Critics have suggested you're struggling to find relevant roles as you... He pauses, the slight hesitation deliberate, mature in the industry. A few uncomfortable murmurs ripple through the audience. Marcus has deployed one of his signature tactics, cloaking ageism in industry analysis. The red light on camera too blinks steadily as it captures Sandra's reaction in close-up. Sandra adjusts her position slightly, crossing her legs. The movement isn't defensive, but contemplative. You know, I've always found it fascinating how we measure success in this industry, she says. Numbers on opening weekend determine whether a story was worth telling. But some of my most meaningful work reached fewer people and touched them more deeply. She leans forward, engaging directly rather than retreating. What about you, Marcus? How do you measure the success of your interviews? By ratings or by the conversations they create? The unexpected redirection catches Marcus off guard. His right hand tightens almost imperceptibly around his note cards. In the control room, the director murmurs into her headset, "Stay on, Reed. This is gold." Marcus recovers quickly, ignoring her question with the skill of someone accustomed to controlling narratives. "Let's talk about Ocean's Mirage," he pivots, referring to Sandra's most recent film. "Industry insiders described it as a desperate attempt to recapture your earlier success. The studio reportedly slashed marketing. After early screenings, do you feel responsible for its failure?" The attack is more direct now, designed to provoke. Several audience members shift uncomfortably, while others watch with the uncomfortable fascination of witnesses to a public execution. Sandra's publicist Rachel, watching from the wings, tenses, visibly. This line of questioning wasn't in the pre-interview agreement, but Sandra herself remains composed, her expression thoughtful rather than wounded. "Filmmaking is collaborative art," she responds. "Hundreds of talented people poured their creativity into that project. Success or failure isn't something one person controls." She pauses, then adds, "But I'm curious about your choice of words, Marcus. I'm desperate. Failure. They reveal more about the lens you're viewing through than the subject you're examining." A woman in the front row nods appreciatively. Someone else whispers, "Good for her." The energy in the studio subtly shifts. This isn't following the usual uncensored format, where guests typically become increasingly defensive under Marcus's relentless pressure. Marcus feels the change and decides to escalate. He sets down his cards and leans forward, his posture more aggressive. "Let's be direct, Sandra. You've been in this industry for decades. The roles are drying up. Younger actresses are taking the parts that once would have been yours. Hollywood has always been cruel to women over 40. Does it frighten you to watch yourself become increasingly irrelevant?" The question lands like a physical blow. Several audience members gasp audibly. In the control room, even the cynical director winces. This is Marcus Reed at his most ruthless, the moment when many guests have crumbled on national television. Sandra is still for a moment. When she speaks, her voice is quieter, but somehow fills the studio completely. "Marcus, have you ever watched a sunset?" The non sequitur catches everyone off guard. Marcus blinks, momentarily speechless. What?" "A sunset," Sandra continues, her expression genuinely curious. "Have you ever sat and really watched one, from beginning to end?" Marcus glances at his producer offstage, confusion evident. "This isn't in the playbook. We're not here to discuss sunsets, Sandra," he says, attempting to regain control. "But perhaps we should be," she responds with gentle persistence, "because a sunset is most beautiful, most profound in its later moments, when it's no longer at its highest point, when it begins to transform, to deepen, to share colors you never see at noon." The studio is utterly silent now. Cameras capture the shifting expressions on audience members' faces, confusion giving way to understanding, cynicism melting into reflection. "I'm not frightened by transformation, Marcus. I'm fascinated by it. The roles I'm offered now allow me to explore humanity in ways impossible in my 20s. She smiles, and it reaches her eyes. Relevance isn't about maintaining the same position. It's about bringing meaning to wherever you stand. Marcus's jaw tightens almost imperceptibly. His carefully constructed narrative is slipping away. He needs to redirect to find firmer ground. His eyes narrow as he decides to abandon the career angle entirely. If professional critique isn't working, perhaps personal wounds will expose vulnerability. "Let's talk about your failed marriage," he says abruptly, his voice hardening. "You've carefully cultivated an image of strength since then, but insiders say you were devastated, that you never saw the betrayal coming. How can someone who misreads people so completely claim special insight about anything?" The question lands with brutal force. A palpable tension grips the studio. The cameras catch several audience members covering their mouths in shock at the naked cruelty of the question. But before Sandra can respond, before the audience can process the attack, the network cuts to commercial. a strategic pause that the producers know will only heighten the drama upon return. Behind the scenes, chaos erupts. Sandra's publicist argues heatedly with the executive producer. Marcus Reed sits unmoving, reviewing his next set of questions, oblivious to the subtle but significant shift occurring in the studio. How audience members who arrived eager for controversy now watch him with growing distaste. What no one notices is Sandra herself. While handlers and executives argue around her, she sits quietly, her expression not of someone wounded, but of someone who has just diagnosed an illness and is considering the most compassionate treatment. The commercial break. Timer counts down 30 seconds until they return. 30 seconds until Sandra Bullock responds to the most brutal attack yet. The on-air sign illuminates once more. The studio, which moments ago buzzed with shocked whispers, falls instantly silent. Camera operators focus their lenses, capturing the tension that now stretches between host and guest like a taut wire. Marcus Reed sits with practiced poise, the slight upturn at the corner of his mouth betraying his satisfaction. The question about Sandra's failed marriage, the brutal, unexpected pivot, is the kind of moment that has made Uncensored infamous. In the control room, producers already envision the viral clips, the entertainment headlines tomorrow. Sandra Bullock blindsided, or actress breaks down on Reed's ruthless show. But as the cameras find Sandra's face, something unexpected registers. There is no shock, no hurt, no defensive posture. Instead, she studies Marcus with an expression that combines curiosity and something else, something that resembles compassion. "My marriage," Sandra says, her voice steady and clear. "You're right, Marcus, I didn't see the betrayal coming." Marcus leans forward slightly, sensing vulnerability at last, the chink in her armor he's been searching for. "And yes, I was devastated," she continues, "completely broken open." The audience is utterly still. A woman in the second row presses her hand to her heart, her eyes glistening with empathic tears. "But here's what fascinates me about your question," Sandra says, her tone shifting subtly. "You framed my experience as failure, as evidence of some fundamental flaw in my perception. I wonder why that perspective feels important to you." The question hangs in the air. Marcus blinks, momentarily thrown by the redirection. "This isn't about me, Sandra," he says, his voice carrying a new edge of defensiveness. "My viewers expect honest conversations about the realities celebrities try to hide." "Honest conversations," Sandra repeats thoughtfully. "I value those too. So honestly, Marcus, being broken open taught me more about human connection than all my previous years combined. Not seeing betrayal coming doesn't make someone flawed. It means they chose to see the best in another person." Several audience members nod. In the back row, an older man dabs at his eyes. Marcus shifts strategy, sensing the emotional current in the room turning against him. "Let's talk about what came after," he says, shuffling his cards. "You've been notoriously private about your romantic life since then. Sources close to you suggest trust issues have prevented new relationships. Others say you've used your children as a shield against intimacy. How much has this failure shaped your life since?" The repeated use of failure, the calculated mention of her children, these are deliberate provocations. The audience tenses, recognizing the escalation. Sandra takes a slow breath, then does something unexpected. She smiles, not the polite, media-trained smile from earlier, but something genuine and slightly sad. "Marcus, may I ask how old you are?" The question catches him completely off guard. I'm 48, he answers, confusion momentarily, overtaking his practiced persona. "And in those 48 years, have you ever experienced heartbreak?" The studio grows impossibly quieter. This isn't in the format of Uncensored. Guests don't ask questions. They defend, explain, occasionally break down. They certainly don't turn the lens around. Marcus's jaw tightens. "We're here to discuss your life, not mine." "But that's just it," Sandra says gently. "We're discussing life, the universal experiences that connect all of us. Heartbreak isn't a celebrity experience. It's a human one." She leans forward slightly. "The pain I felt wasn't special or unique. It was the same pain millions of people have felt, the same pain you might have felt. For a fraction of a second, something flickers across Marcus's face, so brief the cameras almost miss it. In the control room, the director whispers, "Zoom in on Reed," because for that split second, the armor cracked, revealing something raw underneath. Marcus recovers quickly, but his rhythm is disrupted. "Your divorce was public spectacle," he counters, more forcefully than necessary. "People watched you fall apart on the world stage." "Yes," Sandra agrees, her voice softening. "They did. And isn't that interesting? That we've created a culture where pain becomes entertainment, where watching someone struggle becomes something to consume with popcorn?" A murmur ripples through the audience. On social media, clips from the interview are already trending, but not for the reasons the producers anticipated. Sandra wisdom is beginning to outpace uncensored drama. Marcus, sensing the shift, decides to abandon this line completely. If he can't provoke reaction through her past relationships, perhaps her children, her most fiercely protected aspect of life, will provide the vulnerability he seeks. "Your decision to adopt children as a single mother raised significant controversy," he says, his tone deliberately clinical. Critics suggested it was selfish, taking children from their culture, denying them a father figure, all to fulfill your own maternal desires. How do you respond to accusations that your children are accessories to your celebrity lifestyle? The question lands like a physical blow. Several audience members gasp audibly. Others look down, uncomfortable with the cruelty. In the wings, Sandra's publicist moves forward, ready to intervene, but Sandra raises her hand slightly, a subtle signal to stay back. When she speaks, her voice has changed. There's still warmth, still measured control, but beneath it runs something steely, a mother's protective instinct channeled into measured words. "Marcus, what do you hope for?" she asks. He frowns. "Excuse me?" "In your life, what do you hope for? What matters most?" Marcus glances at his producer off stage, visibly irritated by the continued deviation from format. "Sandra, let's focus on answering the question I asked." "I believe I am," she responds, "because at the heart of your question is a fundamental misunderstanding about love, about family, about what makes a life meaningful." She adjusts her position, sitting straighter. "You know, before I became a mother, I achieved every career goal I'd ever set. I had the house, the Oscar, the recognition, and yet something essential was missing. Not because motherhood completes a woman, that's a damaging myth, but because for me personally I yearn to give love in its purest form." The studio has transformed. What began as a gladiatorial arena now feels almost sacred. A space where something authentic is unfolding. "My children aren't accessories. They're my teachers. They've shown me parts of myself I never knew existed, both my capacity for love and my capacity for growth." She pauses, then adds with gentle firmness, "And they are off limits for this conversation." The boundary is clear, delivered not with celebrity indignation, but with quiet dignity. Even Marcus seems to recognize a line has been drawn that even uncensored cannot cross. But Marcus Reed didn't build his career by respecting boundaries. As the segment heads toward its midpoint, he decides to push even harder. If Sandra Bullock won't break under personal attacks, perhaps professional ones will find their target. After the break, he announces to the camera, we'll discuss the roles Sandra Bullock couldn't get, the younger actresses who've replaced her, and whether her best work is behind her. As they cut to commercial, Marcus doesn't notice how the audience watches him, not with the eager anticipation of earlier, but with growing discomfort. Nor does he notice how Sandra closes her eyes briefly, not in distress, but in what appears to be preparation for what comes next. The battle lines have been redrawn, and when they return, nothing will go as Marcus Reed expects. The commercial break ends, and the studio lights intensify once more. Something has shifted during those few minutes off-air. The production assistants exchanged worried glances. The show's executive producer had a heated whisper with Marcus, who dismissed whatever concern was raised with a curt shake of his head. Social media is erupting with reactions to the first half of the interview, not all favorable to the host. Marcus. Reed straightens his posture, adjusts his crimson tie, and faces the camera with renewed determination. His reputation is built on breaking celebrities, on extracting moments of vulnerability that will trend for days. Sandra Bullock's composed responses have denied him that moment, so far. "Welcome back to Uncensored," Marcus says, his voice carrying a harder edge than before the break. "We're here with Sandra Bullock, discussing her career, her personal choices, and her relevance in today's Hollywood." The word relevance carries a subtle sting, deliberately chosen. Sandra sits, quietly, her hands relaxed in her lap, watching Marcus with that same curious, almost analytical expression. "Sandra," Marcus begins, leaning forward, "let's talk about adoption." A perceptible tension ripples through the audience. Even seasoned viewers of Uncensored recognize when a line is about to be crossed. You chose to adopt 2 children from different backgrounds. Critics have suggested this was cultural appropriation dressed up as charity, taking children from their heritage to serve your desire for motherhood. Some have even called it a white savior complex. How do you respond to that? The accusation hangs in the air, brutal and direct. In the control room, a junior producer whispers, "Jesus, Marcus," while the director simply motions for camera 3 to zoom in on Sandra's face, hunting for signs of distress. Sandra takes a measured breath. When she speaks, her voice is quieter than before, requiring the audience to lean in, to truly listen. "When my son was placed in my arms for the first time," she begins, "he was 8 months old. He didn't see a white woman or a celebrity or someone with a complex. He saw the person who would comfort him when he cried, who would protect him from harm, who would love him unconditionally for the rest of his life." She pauses, and the studio is utterly silent. "The greatest gift parenthood has taught me is that love transcends categories. The bonds between parent and child aren't defined by matching skin color or shared genetics. They're defined by thousands of moments. Midnight fevers, first steps, bedtime stories, band-aids on scraped knees." Several audience members nod, some wiping away tears. A father in the 4th row pulls out his phone, glances at his lock screen showing his children, and slips it back into his pocket with a slight smile. "As for their heritage," Sandra continues, "that isn't something I've taken from them. It's something we explore together, honor together, celebrate together. Their identities aren't diminished by my love. They're expanded by it, just as mine is expanded by theirs." Marcus shifts in his seat, visibly frustrated. This wasn't the defensive justification he'd anticipated. He glances at his notes, then decides to push harder. "But what about their right to their original culture? By raising them in your privileged Hollywood world, haven't you denied them their authentic identities? Their birth mothers may not have had your resources, but they shared something with those children that you fundamentally cannot. The attack is nakedly cruel now, designed to wound." Several audience members exchange uncomfortable glances. This has gone beyond entertainment, beyond even the usual uncensored provocations. Sandra is still for a moment. Something flickers across her face, not hurt exactly, but a recognition of the deliberate cruelty behind the question. Then she does something unexpected. She smiles with genuine warmth that reaches her eyes. "Marcus, may I ask you something personal?" His expression hardens. "As I've said before, this interview is about you, not me." "I understand," Sandra nods. "But I'm curious, what made you want to become a journalist originally? Before Uncensored, before all this?" She gestures to the set around them. "What drew you to this profession?" The question catches him completely off guard. For a brief moment, his practiced facade wavers, revealing confusion and, more surprisingly, a flash of something that looks almost like longing. "I think that's not relevant to our discussion." His voice lacks its usual authority. "I think it might be," Sandra says gently, "because, at its heart, journalism is about truth, about understanding the human condition, about creating connection through stories." She leans forward slightly, as if they're the only 2 people in the room. "When I look at the questions you're asking, I don't see someone searching for truth. I see someone hunting for pain. And I wonder if that's really what drew you to this work in the beginning. The studio is utterly silent. The director in the eye, control room whispers, "Stay on the two-shot," recognizing that something extraordinary is happening. The power dynamic of the interview is completely inverting. Marcus's jaw tightens. For the first time, he appears genuinely unsettled. "My career choices aren't up for psychoanalysis, Ms. Bullock. Now, returning to the question of your children's cultural identity, their cultural identity is rich, complex, and evolving," Sandra interrupts, her voice firm but not unkind. "Just like every human being's identity, just like yours, Marcus, just like mine." She pauses, then adds, "And they are children, not talking points, not ammunition for ratings. Children." The simplicity of this truth lands with unexpected force. In the audience, a woman whispers, "That's right," just loudly enough to be heard. Marcus realizes he's losing control of the segment entirely. Anger flashes in his eyes, not the performed indignation he often uses for dramatic effect, but genuine frustration. He abandons his notes entirely and goes for the most personal attack yet. "Your insistence on privacy around your children is convenient," he says, his voice cold. "Some might say it's because you're hiding the reality, that despite your resources and supposed maternal instincts, you're struggling. Sources close to your household suggest behavioral issues, academic problems, attachment disorders. The perfect family narrative you've constructed may be just that, a construction." Gasps erupt from the audience. Even by uncensored standards, this crosses a line. Sandra's publicist steps forward from the wings, ready to end the interview. But Sandra raises her hand slightly, a subtle signal to wait. For the first time, genuine anger flashes in Sandra's eyes. Not the defensive anger Marcus hoped to provoke, but something more powerful, the righteous protection of a mother defending not herself, but her children. When she speaks, her voice is steel wrapped in silk. "Marcus," she says, leaning forward, "I believe there's a better person inside you than the one asking these questions. I have to believe that. And I hope someday you find your way back to him." The words land with unexpected force. Not an attack. Not a defense, but something far more devastating. Compassion mixed with disappointment. For a moment, Marcus Reed, the man who has made celebrities cry, who has ended careers with a single question, appears suddenly exposed, vulnerable, in a way he never intended. The red light on camera one blinks steadily. The world is watching, and as the segment heads to its next commercial break, the audience witnesses something they never expected. Marcus Reed, for the first time in the history of Uncensored, at a complete loss for words. The tension in Studio 7 has transformed. What began as entertainment, the anticipated spectacle of celebrity discomfort, has become something unrecognizable to regular uncensored viewers. The commercial break ends, and cameras pan across audience members whose expressions have shifted from eager anticipation to something more complex. Some appear uncomfortable, others moved, many utterly captivated by the unexpected turn of events. Marcus Reed returns with renewed determination. His producer's urgent whispers during the break, about social media erupting with Triangle and Team Sandra hashtags and viewers criticizing his approach, have only hardened his resolve. He built his career on breaking celebrities, not befriending them. He won't be outmaneuvered on his own show. "Welcome back to Uncensored," he says, his trademark confidence firmly back in place. We're continuing our conversation with Sandra Bullock. Sandra sits composed, the brief flash of protective anger from before now settled back into calm attentiveness. If Marcus's previous attacks affected her, she's showing no lingering signs. Marcus adopts a new strategy. If personal attacks haven't worked, perhaps professional criticism will find its mark. Every actor has ego, after all, especially those with Oscars. "Sandra, let's talk about your actual craft," he begins, emphasizing the word subtly. "You won an Academy Award for The Blind Side, a film some critics now consider problematic in its portrayal of race relations. Did you recognize those issues at the time? Or were you simply grateful to finally receive recognition after decades of lightweight roles?" The question is expertly constructed. the backhanded compliment of her Oscar wrapped around the suggestion of poor judgment and superficial past work. Sandra tilts her head slightly, considering. "That's an interesting framing, Marcus," she says. "I notice how you positioned finally and lightweight to suggest my career lacked substance before that." "Moment." Marcus smiles thinly. "I'm simply stating the industry consensus. Before The Blind Side, you were known primarily for romantic comedies and action films, hardly the material of serious artistic consideration." A murmur ripples through the audience. Sandra's extensive filmography spans genres and decades. To reduce it so dismissively feels deliberately provocative. "You know, I've always been fascinated by how we categorize art," Sandra responds, her tone thoughtful rather than defensive. "How we decide what has value and what doesn't. A film that makes someone laugh during their darkest day. Is that lightweight? A movie that helps someone escape their pain for 2 hours, is that insignificant?" She adjusts her position slightly, leaning forward. "As for The Blind Side, every film exists in its cultural moment. The conversations we're having now about representation are vital, necessary evolutions in storytelling. I listen to those criticisms and learn from them. Growth isn't about claiming perfect judgment. It's about remaining open to new understanding." Several audience members nod in appreciation. Marcus, however, presses on. "Speaking of judgment, you've made some questionable career choices in recent years. Gravity was your last universally acclaimed performance, and that was over a decade ago. Since then, you've turned down roles that went to actresses who received nominations. Do you regret the paths not taken, now that your phone rings less often?" The attack is pointed, suggesting both failing relevance and poor decision-making. In the control room, even the cynical director winces slightly. Sandra smiles, and surprising everyone, she laughs, a genuine warm sound that momentarily transforms the atmosphere. "Marcus, do you know what freedom is?" she asks. He blinks, momentarily thrown by the unexpected response. "I'm not sure how that's relevant." "It's entirely relevant," Sandra continues, "because at some point in my journey, I discovered something incredible. The freedom to choose based on what feels meaningful, not what others expect. The freedom to say no without fear. The freedom to define success by my own measures." She gestures slightly with her hand. "I you frame my choices as failures because they didn't result in certain external validations. But what if they were actually victories of alignment, of authenticity?" Marcus's frustration edges into his voice. "That sounds like convenient reframing. Of diminishing opportunities. Or perhaps," Sandra counters gently, "it's recognizing that a career isn't a straight line upward. It's a journey with seasons. Winter isn't less valuable than summer. It's simply different, with its own purpose and beauty." A woman in the front row snaps her fingers in appreciation. Others nod, visibly moved by the perspective. Marcus shifts strategy again, going for a more direct attack. "Let's be honest, Sandra. You've been replaced by younger talent. Emily Blunt, Jessica Chastain, Margot Robbie. They're getting the roles that would have gone to you a decade ago. Hollywood's obsession with youth is brutal. Doesn't it frustrate you to watch that transition happen, to become increasingly invisible?" The question hangs in the air, its cruelty naked and deliberate. But instead of injury, Sandra's expression reflects something unexpected, genuine curiosity. "Is that what you think happens, Marcus? That we simply disappear? That our value expires?" she asks, her voice soft but clear. "What a limited view of human potential that represents." She straightens slightly in her chair. "I don't see Emily, Jessica or Margot as my replacements. I see them as brilliant artists on their own journeys, telling stories I couldn't tell. Their success doesn't diminish mine. It expands what's possible for all women in this industry." She pauses, then adds, "The question isn't whether I'm being replaced. The question is why we're so invested in a narrative that pits women against each other across generations, that measures our worth by such narrow metrics." Marcus attempts to interrupt, but Sandra continues with gentle firmness. "You know what excites me at this point in my career? The depth I can bring to characters now that I couldn't at 30. The collaborative relationships built on decades of mutual respect. the freedom to champion new voices and perspectives. Her words resonate through the studio. A man in the back row whispers to his companion, "She's incredible." Several others nod in agreement. Marcus feels the interview slipping further from his control. His usual tactics, provocation, insults disguised as questions, attempts to trigger insecurity, are not just failing but backfiring. His expression hardens as he decides on a final approach. "Your perspective sounds enlightened, Sandra," he says, his tone now openly sarcastic. But isn't that just what someone says? When they're no longer being offered the roles they want, when they've been quietly phased out of an industry that's moved on, you can frame it as wisdom, but isn't it really just rationalization of irrelevance? The attack is blatant now, abandoning even the pretense of journalistic inquiry. Several audience members shift uncomfortably in their seats. In the wings, producers exchange worried glances. This has gone beyond the show's usual provocative style into something that feels uncomfortably personal. Marcus Reed lashing out not as a strategic interviewer, but as someone increasingly frustrated. Sandra studies him for a long moment. When she speaks, her voice carries a new quality, not anger, not defensiveness, but a clarity that commands attention. "Marcus, what are you afraid of?" The question lands with unexpected impact. Marcus physically recoils slightly, as if the words carried physical weight. "Excuse me?" His voice has lost its smooth confidence. "What are you afraid of?" Sandra repeats, her expression genuinely curious. "Because beneath all these questions, about relevance and replacement and diminishment, I hear fear, and I wonder if perhaps you're not really asking about my career at all." The studio falls utterly silent. Marcus Reed, for the first time in the history of Uncensored, appears completely exposed, not by what he's asked, but by what has been recognized in him. The segment timer indicates they must break for commercial. Marcus announces it mechanically, his eyes never leaving Sandra's face, his expression unreadable. As the cameras cut away, the unspoken question lingers in the air between them. Who is really being uncensored in this conversation? The commercial break stretches longer than usual. Behind the scenes, network executives have joined the producers in urgent, hushed conversations. Ratings are skyrocketing, not because of Sandra Bullock's discomfort, as anticipated, but because of the unexpected depth and wisdom of her responses. Social media is ablaze with clips, quotes, and overwhelming support for the actress. Marcus Reed Exposed is trending alongside Use Sandra Wisdom. In his earpiece, Marcus receives conflicting instructions. The show's executive producer urges him to dial back the aggression, while his personal producer encourages him to push harder, to reassert control. Marcus Reed built his brand on being merciless, uncompromising. To soften now would be to admit defeat. When the on-air light illuminates once more, Marcus has made his choice. His expression is steel, his posture rigid with determination. If personal attacks and career criticism haven't broken Sandra Bullock, perhaps existential doubts will expose the vulnerability he's hunting for. "Welcome back to Uncensored," he begins, his voice carrying a new intensity. "We're continuing our conversation with Sandra Bullock." Sandra sits with the same composed presence she's maintained throughout, though observers might notice a slight softening in her expression, not from fatigue but from something that looks remarkably like compassion for the man across from her. Marcus leans forward, abandoning all pretense of casual inquiry. "Sandra, you're 59 years old now. The average American woman lives to 81. You've lived through more of your life than you have left. Does that terrify you?" The question lands with deliberate weight. In the audience, several people wince at the naked confrontation with mortality. This is beyond professional criticism or personal judgment. It's an attempt to force Sandra to face the ultimate human vulnerability. For the first time, Sandra doesn't immediately respond. She takes a breath, her gaze drifting momentarily past Marcus, past the cameras, as if looking at something only she can see. The studio is utterly silent, the tension palpable. When she finally speaks, her voice is quiet, but carries to every corner of the studio. "When I was in my 20s, she begins, I was terrified of aging. In my industry and our culture, we're taught that a woman's value diminishes with each passing year. That youth is the currency we must desperately cling to. She brings her focus back to Marcus, meeting his gaze directly. But something unexpected happened as I actually experienced aging. With each year, I became more myself, less concerned with external validation, more attuned to what genuinely matters. She smiles softly. The question isn't how much time has passed or how much remains. The question is whether we're truly present for the moments we're given. Marcus presses forward, undeterred. That sounds very enlightened, but let's be honest. Hollywood discards older women. The roles disappear, the attention shifts, you become invisible. In an industry that once celebrated your every move, doesn't that approaching irrelevance keep you awake at night? A woman in the front row shakes her head in disbelief at the blatant ageism. Others murmur in disapproval. But Sandra remains unruffled. Visibility. To whom, Marcus? She asks, her tone genuinely curious. Whose gaze are we centering in that question? There's a profound difference between being invisible to the public eye and being invisible to what matters. She adjusts slightly in her chair, leaning forward. I've experienced both sides of fame, being recognized everywhere and being left alone. And I can tell you with complete certainty that being seen is not the same as being known. Marcus shifts tactics slightly, sensing he's losing ground. But your entire career, your identity has been built around being seen. The applause, the adoration, that validation has defined you for decades. As that fades, as younger actresses take that spotlight, what remains of Sandra Bullock? For the first time, something like sadness flickers across Sandra's face, not for herself, but apparently for the worldview behind the question. Everything that matters remains, she says simply. My capacity to love, my experiences, my relationships, my growth, the impact I've had on others, the lives I've touched. None of that depends on public attention. She pauses, then adds with unexpected gentleness. Marcus, may I share something I've observed about your questions? He hesitates, then nods curtly, unprepared for another role reversal. Each one assumes that external validation, fame, public attention, industry recognition, is the primary source of human worth, she says. Each one frames aging as loss rather than transformation. Each one suggests that being wanted is more important than being whole. The observation lands with surprising impact. In the audience, people exchange glances, struck by the insight. Even some crew members behind the cameras pause, absorbing her words. Marcus feels exposed in a way he never anticipated. His questions about Sandra's fears have somehow revealed his own. He attempts to regain control with his most direct existential challenge yet. What about death, Sandra? His voice is almost challenging now. You've experienced significant loss in your life. You've watched loved ones die. You know it's coming for all of us. In your quietest moments, when the distractions fade and you're alone with that knowledge, tell me you don't feel terror. The question crosses a line that even regular viewers of Uncensored find jarring. This isn't provocative journalism. It's almost desperate in its attempt to provoke reaction. In the control room, the director whispers, "What the hell is he doing?" Sandra's expression shifts to something profoundly still. She doesn't answer immediately, allowing the weight of the question to settle throughout the studio. Several audience members look down, uncomfortable with the naked aggression. "Fear and terror aren't the same thing, Marcus," she finally says, her voice soft but clear. "Fear is natural, a recognition of our attachment to life. Terror is being controlled by that fear, letting it diminish how we live." She looks at him with unexpected warmth. "I've sat with dying loved ones. I've held their hands as they took their final breaths. And do you know what I discovered in those sacred moments?" The studio is utterly silent, hanging on her words. "I discovered that a life well lived carries its own peace at the end. That love doesn't disappear when heartbeats stop. That what we create in our relationships, in our work, in our kindness, that outlives our physical bodies." A tear slips down the cheek of a young woman in the second row. An older man in the back nods slowly, his expression reflecting profound recognition. "So no, Marcus," Sandra continues with gentle certainty. "I don't lie awake in terror. I experience moments of fear, of course, but more often I experience gratitude for each day, each connection, each opportunity to love and be loved. That gratitude doesn't eliminate the fear, but it puts it in perspective. She tilts her head slightly, studying Marcus with that same compassionate curiosity. I wonder when you last felt that kind of gratitude, not for achievements or ratings, but simply for being alive, for having the chance to make meaning with the time you're given. The question isn't accusatory or defensive, it's genuinely inquiring, an invitation rather than an attack. And in that moment, something unprecedented happens on the set of Uncensored. Marcus Reed, the man famous for never revealing himself, for always remaining the calculated interrogator, looks momentarily lost. The facade cracks, not dramatically, but in the subtle shift of his expression, as if something long buried is rising to the surface. For 3 seconds, an eternity in live television, Marcus doesn't speak, doesn't counter, doesn't deflect. He simply sits with Sandra's question, visibly moved despite himself. The segment timer indicates they must break for the final commercial. Marcus announces it mechanically, his voice lacking its usual confident edge. As the cameras cut away, the studio remains utterly silent, the audience witnessing something they never expected from Uncensored, not exposure of a celebrity's vulnerabilities, but a glimpse into the host's own unaddressed fears. Behind the scenes, producers exchange worried glances. This isn't the Marcus Reed they know. And as the final segment approaches, no one, not the crew, not the audience, perhaps not even Marcus himself, knows exactly what will happen when the cameras return. The extended commercial break feels like a strategic timeout. In the wings, network executives huddle with producers, their expressions tense. This is unprecedented territory for Uncensored, a host visibly affected by his guest, an audience increasingly sympathetic to the person who was meant to be dissected for entertainment. Social media continues to explode with reactions, the vast majority praising Sandra's grace under pressure, while questioning Marcus's tactics. In his chair, Marcus Reed sits alone, refusing the makeup touch-up offered by a hovering staff member. His producer approaches, whispering urgently about changing course, about salvaging the interview with a more conventional, friendly closing segment. Marcus dismisses him with a curt gesture. He didn't build his career by retreating. Sandra Bullock has somehow turned his own show against him, transformed his calculated provocations into reflections of his own insecurities. He won't let that stand. When the on-air light illuminates for the final segment, the atmosphere in Studio 7 crackles with tension. Camera operators exchange meaningful glances, sensing the unusual energy. The audience, which arrived expecting typical, uncensored entertainment, now leans forward collectively, uncertain what will unfold, but somehow aware they're witnessing something significant. Welcome back to the final segment of tonight's Uncensored, Marcus begins, his voice carrying a new edge, not the controlled provocation of earlier, but something raw, almost personal. We're concluding our conversation with Sandra Bullock. Sandra sits with the same composed presence she's maintained throughout, though there's a watchful quality to her now, as if she senses the shift in Marcus's approach. Sandra, Marcus begins, abandoning all pretense of journalistic inquiry, you've spent this interview deflecting questions, redirecting focus, presenting yourself as enlightened and evolved. It's a masterful performance. He emphasizes the last word deliberately, his expression hardening. But let's address what you've carefully avoided discussing. 3 years ago, you abruptly cancelled promotion for your film The Lost City, disappeared from public view for months, and returned noticeably changed. Industry insiders reported a complete breakdown. Not aging gracefully, not philosophical evolution, a psychological collapse. The attack is brutal in its directness. A collective gasp ripples through the audience. Even veteran crew members look uncomfortable. This crosses the line from provocative journalism into something that feels personally vindictive. Marcus presses on, seemingly emboldened by the reaction. Sources close to you described episodes of paralyzing anxiety, inability to leave your home, professional commitments abandoned. Yet here you sit, presenting wisdom about life and death, about presence and meaning. while hiding the reality that you couldn't handle the pressures of the very career you're now philosophizing about. The studio falls completely silent. In the control room, the director whispers, tight on Sandra, knowing this moment, however it unfolds, will be replayed and analyzed for days. For the first time in the interview, Sandra's expression changes significantly. Not to show hurt or anger as Marcus clearly hopes, but to something more complex. A quiet recognition, a weighing of options. She takes a measured breath before responding. Yes, she says simply. 3 years ago, I experienced what some might call a breakdown. I prefer to think of it as a breakthrough. Her directness catches Marcus off guard. He expected defensiveness, perhaps even the emotional reaction he's been hunting for throughout the interview. Instead, Sandra leans slightly forward, her voice steady and clear. For decades, I moved at an unsustainable pace. I prioritized work over well-being, achievement over presence, and eventually my body and mind said enough, not with a whisper but with a scream I couldn't ignore. She holds Marcus's gaze with unflinching steadiness. What you're framing as weakness, as something to be ashamed of and hidden, was actually one of the most courageous chapters of my life. It took more strength to stop, to face myself, to rebuild from the inside out, than it ever took to push through another film or press tour. In the audience, several people nod in recognition. A middle-aged woman dabs at her eyes. What Marcus intended as exposure of vulnerability has somehow transformed into testimony of strength. As for hiding it, Sandra continues, there's a profound difference between privacy and secrecy. I chose not to make my healing process a public spectacle, not because I was ashamed, but because some journeys are sacred. Some transformations require protected space. Marcus shifts in his seat, visibly frustrated by her continued composure. He decides on one final desperate attack, the card he's been holding in reserve. Your carefully constructed narrative about personal growth conveniently overlooks the impact on others, he says coldly. The film's release was compromised. Co-stars had to cover your obligations. Crew members whose livelihoods depended on the film's success were affected by your breakthrough. He loads the last word with sarcasm. Your search for meaning left collateral damage you've never acknowledged. The accusation hangs in the air that Sandra's self-care came at others' expense, that her wellness was others' hardship. It's the kind of moral complexity that might finally break through her composed exterior. Sandra doesn't respond immediately. She appears to be genuinely considering his words, giving them the weight of serious reflection. When she speaks, her voice carries new emotion, not defensiveness but authentic regret. You're right, she says quietly. My journey affected others. There were financial implications, professional disruptions. People I care about had to adapt to my absence, carry weight that should have been mine. That's a truth I've had to face, and make amends for as best I could. She pauses, then continues with gentle firmness. And yet there's another truth alongside it. If I hadn't stopped when I did, the consequences could have been far more severe. For me and for everyone connected to that project. There's no value created when we sacrifice our essential well-being on the altar of productivity. A soft murmur of agreement ripples through the audience. What Marcus positioned as selfish now registers as courageous. The difficult choice to prioritize health over obligation, to break a destructive cycle before it broke her completely. You know, Marcus, Sandra continues, her tone shifting to something warmer, almost confiding. Behind your question is an assumption I once shared, that our worth is measured by what we produce, not who we are. That our value lies in never stopping, never showing weakness, never admitting limitation. She looks at him with unexpected kindness. I wonder what price you've paid for that belief. What it's cost you to maintain the image of someone who never breaks, never questions, never needs rest or reflection? The question isn't accusatory but genuinely curious, an invitation rather than an attack. And for the second time in this unprecedented interview, Marcus Reed appears momentarily speechless. Something flickers across his face, recognition, perhaps, or the beginning of reluctant self-reflection. The studio remains utterly silent, the audience collectively holding its breath. The dynamic has inverted completely. Sandra Bullock, who was meant to be exposed and dissected, now sees Marcus Reed with a clarity he finds deeply unsettling. In the control room, producers exchange worried glances. This isn't just an interview, gone off script. It's a fundamental challenge to the entire premise of Uncensored, to the idea that vulnerability is weakness, that worth is measured by perfection, that struggles should remain hidden. Marcus glances at the segment timer. 3 minutes remain. 3 minutes to reassert control, to reclaim his reputation, to transform this unexpected defeat into something he can frame as victory. But as he looks back at Sandra, something in her expression, not pity, not judgment, but genuine compassion, makes him hesitate. For perhaps the first time in his career, Marcus Reed isn't certain of his next move. The cameras capture this moment of authentic uncertainty, a host confronted not by a defensive celebrity, but by the possibility that the values underpinning his entire approach might deserve reconsideration. For 3 seconds, an eternity in live television, Marcus Reed is silent. The man known for his quick retorts, his seamless pivots, his relentless questioning, simply sits. The atmosphere in Studio 7 has transformed completely. What began as a battleground now feels like a space of unexpected revelation. When Marcus finally speaks, his voice carries a quality that regular viewers of Uncensored have never heard before: uncertainty. "We should move on to your upcoming project," he says, reaching for the familiar script of celebrity interviews, the safe territory of promotion and publicity. But Sandra Bullock doesn't follow his lead. Instead, she tilts her head slightly, studying him with gentle curiosity. "Marcus," she says softly, "throughout this conversation, you've asked me about aging, about relevance, about fear, about failure. You've questioned my choices as a mother, as an actress, as a woman navigating this industry." She pauses, her expression open and unguarded. "Now I'd like to ask you something, if that's all right." The request is delivered with such genuine warmth that refusing would seem petty, defensive. In the control room, producers lean forward, as surprised as the audience by this unprecedented development. Marcus hesitates, then gives a curt nod, his jaw tight with tension. "What do you hope for?" Sandra asks. The simplicity of the question catches everyone off guard. Not an attack, not a gotcha moment, not an attempt to expose hypocrisy, but a genuine inquiry about aspiration, about meaning. "Excuse me?" Marcus responds, buying time, visibly thrown by the direction. "In your life," Sandra clarifies, her voice gentle but direct, "beyond ratings and recognition, beyond being known as the interviewer who never backs down, what do you hope your life will have meant? What matters to you, Marcus Reed?" The question lands with unexpected weight. In the audience, people lean forward, suddenly invested in his answer in a way they've never been before. Uncensored has always been about exposing guests, never about revealing its host. Marcus shifts in his seat, his discomfort evident. "This interview isn't about me, Sandra, it's about you." His voice lacks its usual authority, the deflection transparent to everyone watching. "Every question reveals something about the person asking it," Sandra responds. "Throughout our conversation, you've focused consistently on external validation, on visibility, on relevance, on others' perceptions. And I wonder if those are the questions that occupy your own thoughts." The observation is delivered without judgment, but with such clarity that it resonates through the studio. Marcus's expression tightens, a mixture of surprise and recognition flickering across his features. "That's an interesting attempt to redirect," he counters, trying to reclaim familiar ground. A classic defensive technique. Sandra smiles, not with triumph, but with warmth. Or perhaps it's a genuine attempt at connection, at conversation rather than confrontation. She leans forward slightly, her voice softening further. "You know, in preparing for this interview, I watched hours of Uncensored, episode after episode of you asking brilliant, accomplished people to justify their existence, to defend their choices, to prove their worth." She pauses, holding his gaze with compassionate steadiness, and I couldn't help wondering, who taught you that vulnerability was weakness? Who convinced you that worth must be continually proven? What would it be like for you to be truly seen, Marcus, not as the incisive host, but as the human being beneath that role? The questions aren't rhetorical. They're offered with genuine curiosity, an invitation to authentic exchange. The studio is utterly silent, the audience collectively holding its breath. For a moment, brief but unmistakable, something raw and unguarded flashes across Marcus Reed's face. Not anger, not defensive pride, but something that looks remarkably like longing, quickly masked by professional composure. "We have less than 2 minutes remaining," he says, glancing at the timer. "Perhaps we should use it to discuss your foundation's work with education initiatives." But Sandra gently persists, her expression reflecting not the satisfaction of someone who has won an encounter, but the genuine interest of someone who has glimpsed something human beneath a carefully constructed persona. "There's time enough for that," she says. "But first, I'd like to share something with you, if I may." Despite himself, Marcus nods, unable to reassert the combative dynamic that has defined Uncensored since its inception. "Before coming here, today," Sandra begins, "many people warned me about this interview, about your tactics, your approach, your reputation for breaking even the most composed guests." She smiles softly. "They told me to prepare for battle." The audience murmurs in recognition. Marcus's reputation is well known. "But as I watched your previous interviews," Sandra continues, "I saw something beyond the provocative questions and uncomfortable moments. I saw someone searching for authenticity in an industry built on illusion, someone pushing past rehearsed answers to find something real." Her observation lands with surprising insight. Even Marcus appears momentarily taken aback by this reading of his work, not as cruelty for ratings, but as a misguided search for truth. "The methods may be questionable," Sandra acknowledges with gentle candor, "but the impulse to move beyond surface-level conversation, to challenge the carefully constructed narratives we all present, that's actually something I deeply value." For the first time in the interview, Marcus Reed appears genuinely seen, not as the calculated provocateur, but as someone with intentions and values beneath the abrasive approach. The realization visibly affects him, his posture shifting almost imperceptibly. "You've built your career on uncensoring others," Sandra says, her voice warm with understanding. "I wonder what might be possible if you allowed yourself the same. Freedom?" The question hangs in the air, not as challenge but as invitation. In the audience, people exchange glances, sensing they're witnessing something transformative. Not the public humiliation of a celebrity, but the possible beginning of a journey for the man who has made his name exposing others' vulnerabilities, while guarding his own. Marcus looks at Sandra for a long moment. When he speaks, his voice carries a quality that regular viewers of Uncensored have never heard before: authenticity. "I started in journalism to uncover truth," he says quietly. The admission clearly unplanned. Somewhere along the way, it became about creating moments, about ratings, about being the one who could break through carefully constructed images. The studio is utterly silent, the audience collectively leaning forward, hardly believing what they're hearing. Marcus Reed voluntarily revealing something personal, something true. "I don't know when that changed," he continues, his voice carrying a note of genuine reflection. "When finding truth became less important than creating spectacle." Sandra nods, not with triumph, but with recognition. One human acknowledging another's moment of clarity. The segment timer flashes, 30 seconds remaining. Marcus glances at it, then back at Sandra, something shifting in his expression. For perhaps the first time in the history of Uncensored, the timer's pressure seems irrelevant compared to the authentic exchange unfolding. "We're out of time," he says, but without the usual brisk efficiency. There's a quality to his voice, a thoughtfulness, perhaps even the beginning of gratitude, that transforms the standard closing. "Sandra Bullock," he continues, "thank you for being here tonight." The words are the same he's said to hundreds of guests over the years, but the tone, stripped of sarcasm, of performative charm, of calculated distance, is entirely new. As the cameras prepare to cut away, Sandra reaches across the space between them and briefly touches his hand. Not for the cameras, not as performance, but as one person acknowledging another's humanity. "Thank you for the conversation, Marcus," she says simply. And as the studio lights dim and the on-air sign darkens, Something has irrevocably shifted in Studio 7. Not just for this episode, not just for the millions watching at home, but perhaps for Marcus Reed himself, the hunter who, against all expectations, found himself gently but thoroughly uncensored. As the uncensored logo appears for the final time and the show cuts to commercial, Studio 7 remains in a state of suspended animation. The audience, which typically erupts into chatter the moment cameras stop rolling, sits in collective silence processing what they've just witnessed. It wasn't the spectacle of celebrity discomfort they'd expected, but something far more profound, a genuine human connection forming where antagonism once dominated. The floor director finally breaks the spell with a quiet, "We're clear, Sandra." Bullock rises from her chair with graceful ease. Marcus Reed remains seated for a moment longer, his expression unreadable. When he finally stands, there's a noticeable difference in his posture, something less rigid, less performatively confident. The two regard each other across the small distance that separates their chairs. "That wasn't what I expected," Marcus says quietly. The admission offered only to Sandra, though several nearby audience members lean forward, straining to hear. Sandra smiles, the warmth reaching her eyes. The most meaningful conversations rarely are. Around them, the studio buzzes back to life. Production assistants dart between equipment, crew members begin dismantling cameras, audience handlers prepare to guide people toward the exits. But at the center of this activity, Sandra and Marcus remain in a moment of unexpected connection. "Your publicist probably won't let you within a mile of my show again," Marcus says, a hint of his usual sardonic tone returning, though without the earlier edge. "Actually," Sandra responds with a small laugh, "I think she might be your biggest fan right now." She gestures toward the wings where Rachel stands, her expression a mixture of amazement and vindication. The studio audience begins to rise, but instead of the usual rush toward exits, they remain in place, many watching Sandra and Marcus with undisguised curiosity. Some hold phones, having captured unauthorized moments of the exchange, despite the strict no-recording policy. Already, descriptions of what transpired are flooding social media, creating a narrative very different from what regular uncensored viewers have come to expect. A young woman approaches Sandra tentatively, clutching a well-worn DVD case of The Proposal. "Ms. Bullock," she begins, her voice trembling slightly, "I just wanted to say, what you said about breakdowns actually being breakthroughs, that changed something for me. I've been hiding my own struggles, thinking they made me weak. But the way you spoke about it," her voice breaks slightly. Sandra turns to her with full attention as if this conversation is the only thing that matters in the bustling studio. "What's your name?" she asks gently. "Emily." "Emily, our culture has a profound misunderstanding about strength. True strength isn't about never breaking. It's about how we gather the pieces afterward, what we build from them." As she speaks, others gather around, drawn by the authenticity of the exchange. Marcus watches from a few steps away, something shifting in his expression as he observes Sandra's genuine connection with the young woman, not as a celebrity performing kindness, but as one human recognizing another's struggle. Across the studio, network executives huddle in intense conversation, occasionally glancing toward Marcus. The ratings are already coming in, unprecedented numbers, social media engagement unlike anything uncensored has previously generated. But the narrative isn't what they anticipated. Instead of viral moments of celebrity discomfort, the clips spreading fastest feature Sandra's wisdom and Marcus's unexpected vulnerability. As the crowd around Sandra grows, Marcus steps back, watching from the periphery. A production assistant approaches him hesitantly. "Sir, the network president would like a word. He's in your office." Marcus nods, his gaze still on Sandra as she listens intently to an older woman sharing something that makes her nod in recognition. There's no performative compassion in her attention, just genuine presence. As he turns to leave, Sandra looks up, catching his eye across the distance. For a moment they regard each other, the hunter and the would-be prey, roles now dissolved, into something neither could have predicted. She offers a small, genuine smile. After a brief hesitation, he returns it, not the camera-ready smile of Marcus Reed, television's most feared interviewer, but something more human, more real. In his office, the conversation with network executives is brief but consequential. The unprecedented ratings conflict with widespread criticism of his approach. Social media campaigns are already calling for a format change, for Uncensored to evolve into something that maintains its commitment to authentic conversation without the deliberately cruel provocations. But as Marcus listens to their concerns and suggestions, he finds himself unusually distant from the conversation. His thoughts keep returning to Sandra's question, "What do you hope for?" For the first time in years, he allows himself to consider it not as a rhetorical challenge, but as a genuine inquiry worthy of reflection. Meanwhile, in the green room, Sandra gathers her things, preparing to leave after the unexpected extension of her time in the studio. Rachel approaches, tablet in hand. "You won't believe the response," she says, her voice tinged with amazement. "It's everywhere. Wisdom, not cruelty, is trending. People are sharing your quotes about strength, about transformation, about measuring success by meaning rather than visibility." Sandra smiles, but there's a thoughtfulness to her expression that suggests her mind is elsewhere. "Do you know what struck me most about him?" she asks quietly. Rachel doesn't need clarification about who him is. What? How familiar his questions felt. All those fears about relevance, about aging, about being replaced or forgotten. They weren't really about me. They were universal human concerns, just framed as attacks rather than inquiries. She picks up her bag, ready to leave. The most aggressive people are often fighting battles we know nothing about. As Sandra exits through the private door, avoiding the gathered media outside the main entrance, Marcus Reed sits alone in his office. On the desk before him, a note card with tomorrow's scheduled guest and the planned angles of attack, the usual uncensored preparation. But for the first time in the show's history, he doesn't feel the familiar anticipation of the hunt. Instead, he finds himself opening his laptop, typing Sandra Bullock Foundation Education Initiatives into the search bar. The results show years of quiet, substantive work, far from cameras or public recognition. Impact measured not by visibility, but by lives changed. 3 days later, regular viewers of Uncensored tune in to find something unexpected. Marcus Reed still sits in his familiar chair. The set remains unchanged, but his opening monologue strikes a different tone. "For years this show has been defined by confrontation," he begins, his voice carrying a new quality of reflection. "By the belief that discomfort reveals truth, by my conviction that public figures owe us unfiltered access to their vulnerabilities." He pauses, the studio unusually quiet. But what if true uncensoring isn't about exposing others, but about examining ourselves? What if the most courageous conversations aren't those that tear down, but those that build understanding? As viewers exchange surprised glances in living rooms across the country, Marcus continues, "Tonight marks the beginning of a new chapter for this show. Same name, new purpose. We're still committed to moving beyond rehearsed answers and polished narratives, but with curiosity instead of aggression, with depth instead of spectacle." He smiles, not the predatory smile of previous seasons, but something more authentic. My conversation with Sandra Bullock last week reminded me why I became a journalist in the first place, not to create viral moments of discomfort, but to uncover genuine human stories, to connect rather than confront. The camera pulls back to reveal his guest, not a celebrity but Emily, the young woman who approached Sandra after the show, ready to share her own journey of breakdown and breakthrough. Across town, Sandra watches the broadcast, a small smile playing at her lips. The transformation of Marcus Reed from hunter to listener isn't the victory she sought. It's something far more meaningful, a reminder that beneath our most carefully constructed personas, the human need for connection and understanding remains. The screen fades to black, and a message appears. True strength isn't about never breaking. It's about what we build from the pieces. Soft, reflective music plays as the credits roll. If this story touched you, please like, comment, and share.